Hello, everybody. In this series of webinars, we will be discussing what are the best strategies and techniques to present and practice new language in the context of the English class. Learning outcomes are as follows. Firstly, we want to understand the rationale of the stages of the present and practice teaching sequence. And secondly, we are going to do some analysis of textbook materials, and we will be trying to identify these stages on textbook pages. What we call present and practice has been traditionally called PPP, present practice production, and is a mainstream method in communicative language teaching. It is perhaps the most common structure in those classes in which we present and practice language systems. So mainly we're talking about grammar structures, functions, and lexical sets. There are, of course, alternative approaches, such as task-based approaches, story-based approaches, test-teach-test, content-based teaching, and so on. But as I see it, present and practice offers a useful framework, kind of a foundation that you could then build on and customize it to your needs. And finally, the present practice structure is the one that is most commonly seen in textbook materials that many of us are going to end up using, starting upper primary grades, secondary schools, and secondary school materials, and materials for adults. Now, to present this structure, we're going to use the PDF, Structure of Present and Practice, that is available on the Moodle course, and which we're going to open right away. Okay. Right. We're talking about essentially two parts to the sequence, the present and the practice, but they're actually more complex than they sound. In the presentation, we should include, as in any type of teaching sequence, we should include a lead-in, which purpose is to establish a context, motivate, and kind of get an initial idea of how much students know about the topic or about the language items. After that would come a restricted exposure or some restricted exposure to the target language. Now, this concept is going to become clearer when we analyze textbook materials in the next webinar. Now, the idea would be to introduce the lexical sets, or the grammar structure through texts. Now, the text could be oral or written text. It could be video. It could be audio. It could be a written text with a reading comprehension activities. Those are some typical approaches. Once the context is set, we move on to the presentation or clarification of the new language. And typically here, as we have seen in class, we move from the oral to the written, assuming we do want to use the written. In other words, we start with the meaning and the use, pronunciation, and then we move on to the written form. At the end of the stage, we might want to get the students to, sorry, I missed the previous stage. Checking understanding after presentation. We will check understanding of the target lexis or the target grammar items before students get to practice. As I was saying, we finish the stage with a record. Ask the students to take some notes in their notebook, etc. Now, typically we don't do this whenever we work with textbooks because the textbooks include the record. Now, once the target language has been presented and checked, we would move on to the practice. And here the practice tends to move from more controlled to freer or less controlled. Now, what do we mean by controlled? We mean restricted output and more guided interaction. And typically more on-the-spot feedback. So we're talking about things like oral drills, like micro dialogues, like gap fills in the case of writing, matching tasks, that kind of thing. And eventually, depending on the level of the student and the age, we would be moving on to freer practice. So, information, communication gap, speaking activities, longer, more demanding pieces of writing, etc. Note that when you're lesson planning, when you're preparing your lesson plan, it's important that you incorporate the idea of feedback, that you don't take it for granted, that you plan it. Okay, so how are you going to give feedback? Is it going to be during the activity that you're going to correct? Is it going to be at the end? Are you going to focus on the content of the activity, on the results? How are you going to integrate linguistic feedback? And so on. To finish the video, a couple of remarks that we have here at the bottom of the document. Number one, I call this a sequence because we might choose to use these stages or implement these stages in one single class or in several classes. It's going to depend on the level. It's going to depend on the age of the students. In some primary materials, textbook materials, it's quite common to see these stages spread out across several classes. Some stages may not always be necessary. So you could actually do lead in followed by presentation clarification without restricted exposure. And finally, as I was saying, even if you depart from the traditional PPP or present practice approach, you could still incorporate some of the stages of this approach in whichever strategy or methodology you choose to implement. Okay, so for instance, the checking understanding is always going to be an interesting stage whenever we introduce new language, controls, moving on to freer practice, etc. Right, thank you. So I hope that this video is useful, and please do watch the textbook analysis that will be utilizing these concepts and stages. Thanks a lot.